Val Kilmer's final message before he died at 65 is something no one saw coming. And once you hear what he said, it's impossible to forget. For years he battled illness, lost his voice, and faded from the spotlight. But in his final moments, he recorded something quiet, haunting, and deeply personal. It wasn't meant for cameras, it wasn't part of a movie. According to reports, it was a farewell unlike anything Hollywood's ever seen. And now, pieces of it are finally coming to light. What did Val Kilmer really leave behind? Stick around, because the truth is as heartbreaking as it is powerful. Hollywood says goodbye. News of Val Kilmer's death arrived quietly, but the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. He passed away on April 1st, 2025, at the age of 65. Official reports confirmed the cause: pneumonia. Though Val had overcome throat cancer years earlier, the damage to his body had been profound. He had spent his final years largely bedridden, away from the spotlight that had once defined him. The illness hadn't taken his mind or his spirit, but his health had steadily declined. As word of his passing spread, so did the tributes. From co-stars, directors, artists, fans, and even people who had only known him through his roles. The industry that once wrestled with his intensity now bowed its head in respect. The man who had played Jim Morrison, Batman, Doc Holliday, and Iceman was gone. Tom Cruise was one of the first to speak publicly. Just hours after the news broke, Cruise took the stage at CinemaCon in Las Vegas. He interrupted his own presentation, visibly moved. "I can't tell you how much I admired his work and him as a human being," Cruise said, before leading the entire room in a moment of silence. No music, no applause, just a long pause. It wasn't a PR gesture. It felt personal. Because it was. Director Michael Mann, who worked with Kilmer on Heat, described him as brilliant, possessed, and deeply committed. He said, "He was a storm of a performer, and you could feel it in every scene." Cher, who had once shared both a romance and a close friendship with Kilmer, posted something raw. The post went viral, not because it was polished, but because it felt real. Anyone who knew Val Kilmer knew that mix of brilliance and chaos. He could be difficult, but he was never dull. Josh Brolin posted a short message. "See ya, pal. I'm gonna miss you." Others followed. Jim Carrey, Jennifer Tilly, and Kevin Bacon all offered their reflections. Carrey, who had starred opposite him in Batman Forever, called him a generational talent and said he left behind an enviable legacy of unforgettable performances. But beyond the sound bites and the praise, there was a different tone this time. Something heavier, something unsaid. Fans picked up on it quickly. The way people spoke about Kilmer wasn't just mournful. It was as if they were all carrying the weight of something else. Something more intimate, something final. Of course, many remembered that Kilmer had lost his voice years earlier after undergoing a tracheostomy during his cancer treatment. Speaking became painful, nearly impossible. For a man who once delivered entire monologues with nothing but his eyes and tone, this silence had felt tragic. But he adapted. He used text-to-speech tools. He wrote, he made art, and still he stayed connected. Through his paintings, his poetry, his social media. And yet there was one message he hadn't shared. Not yet. The tributes, the interviews, even the most heartfelt memories. It all seemed to circle around something unspoken, something waiting. It would be easy to assume this was just grief talking, but according to those closest to him, Val had prepared something. Something small, something simple, something filmed long before anyone knew just how close the end really was. But that moment hadn't come yet. And when it did, it would catch the world off guard. The man behind the mask. Before he was Batman. Before he was Iceman. Before the headlines and the health battles, Val Kilmer was a theater kid from Los Angeles with a dream that burned a little hotter than most. He became the youngest person ever admitted to Juilliard's prestigious drama program at the time. And it didn't take long for everyone around him to realize this wasn't just another actor chasing fame. Val was chasing something else, something deeper. He wasn't the type to smile for the camera if he didn't feel like it. That's what made him unpredictable. That's also what made him unforgettable. Kilmer broke onto the scene with Top Secret, a goofy comedy that showed off his surprising singing voice and offbeat comedic instincts. But he didn't stop there. He shifted gears in real genius, then transformed into a brooding Jim Morrison in The Doors. By the time Tombstone came out with Val slurring out, "I'm your Huckleberry," as the dangerously cool Doc Holliday, it was clear he had range. Serious range. But with that talent came a reputation. Kilmer was known for being intense on set. Difficult even. Directors whispered about clashes. Co-stars rolled their eyes behind closed doors. On the set of The Island of Dr. Moreau, things allegedly got so bad that director John Frankenheimer swore he'd never work with Kilmer again. Joel Schumacher, who directed him in Batman Forever, once described him as childish and impossible. Val, for his part, never denied being passionate. He just didn't like to fake it. "I would get upset when I felt a scene was being done poorly," he said years later. "If you're not there to make something great, then why are you even there?" That question followed him throughout his career. He wasn't in it for the game. He wasn't one to nice just to land another role. He was always chasing something more. Truth, art, honesty, and sometimes that pursuit made him hard to handle. But those who really knew him tell a different story. Off camera, he was a painter, a poet, a father, a friend who left long voicemails filled with philosophical ramblings and half-finished ideas. He'd disappear for months, only to return with a stack of photos he took while traveling, or a bizarre short film he shot on his phone. He saw the world differently, and he never stopped trying to capture it. In time, even the public began to see a softer side of him. The release of his 2021 documentary, Val cracked open the polished exterior and revealed the complicated, aching artist underneath. Built from thousands of hours of personal footage he'd recorded since the 80s, the film wasn't a comeback. It was a confession of insecurity, of regret, of the life he'd lived and the parts he wished he could relive. You could see it in his eyes. The same intensity that made him difficult on set was the same force that made him magnetic on screen. It wasn't about control. It was about care. He never stopped creating, even when speaking became a struggle. After the tracheostomy, he lost his voice, but not his drive. He continued to write, post online, make digital art, and show up quietly in the lives of those who still followed him. And through it all, he kept recording. Snippets, clips, thoughts, not always polished, not always meant for anyone else. Just pieces of himself, stored away. That detail would matter later. Because while most people were still focused on the Hollywood image, the capes, the sunglasses, the cool one-liners, Val Kilmer had been documenting something else entirely. Something far more personal. Something he wasn't ready to share. Until the very end. His quiet comeback. By the time Val premiered in 2021, Val Kilmer had already disappeared from the red carpets and magazine covers. But this wasn't a vanishing act. It was a transformation. After years of keeping his health struggles mostly private, the documentary marked the first time he peeled back the curtain and let the world in. And what people saw wasn't just an aging actor. It was a man who had been quietly reinventing himself from the inside out. He didn't sound the same. He didn't look the same. But somehow he was more himself than ever before. Val wasn't your standard Hollywood retrospective. It was stitched together from thousands of hours of home videos, old audition tapes, behind-the-scenes footage, and deeply personal recordings, most of it filmed by Kilmer himself. This wasn't someone else's version of his story. It was his, messy, fragmented, poetic, sometimes joyful, sometimes painful. The documentary wasn't trying to restore his image, it was trying to reveal his soul. Audiences were taken aback. People had expected nostalgia, maybe a few heartfelt moments about his early career. What they got instead was a raw look at a man facing mortality, reckoning with his choices, and trying to find peace in the ruins of fame. There were shots of Val struggling to speak, his voice altered by surgery. There were scenes of him laughing, painting, joking with his kids, talking to fans. It wasn't glossy. It was human. And that vulnerability struck a chord. Suddenly, the narrative around Kilmer began to shift. He wasn't just the moody actor who clashed with directors or walked off sets. He was the artist who'd kept creating long after the world stopped watching. The man who lost his voice but found another way to speak. The Hollywood rebel who traded scripts for sketches, red carpets for quiet corners of art galleries. Even the industry began to circle back. He received new recognition, not for a comeback performance, but for his honesty. There was something brave in the way he showed up on screen. Damaged, but still present. Still searching. And that bravery made people look again. What many didn't realize was how long he had been preparing for this shift. Long before the documentary, Kilmer had been recording himself, not just for projects, but for the sake of capturing life. He had boxes of tapes, external hard drives full of unsorted footage, voice memos, video diaries, scribbled notes on the backs of scripts. For years, he had been archiving moments. Not all of it made sense. Not all of it was usable, but it was there. A record of a life lived loudly, then quietly. Those closest to him said it wasn't about legacy. It was about expression. When speaking became difficult, he found other ways to communicate. Through his artwork, through posts online, through one-on-one conversations with friends and fans, sometimes just with a look. And while most of the world assumed he had stepped away from the spotlight, the truth was, Val never stopped performing. He had just changed the stage. The release of Val didn't launch a second act in the traditional sense. He wasn't signing on to new blockbusters or booking talk shows, but it opened a door. People were listening again, watching again. And in that space, he kept creating. Quietly, carefully, and privately. There were moments in Val that felt like a goodbye. But they weren't. Not yet. The film may have been his most revealing work, but it wasn't his last. Somewhere in the midst of all those recordings, all those thoughts he tucked away for later, there was one message he hadn't shared. And that message would become the moment no one saw coming. The Iceman returns. In 2022, Val Kilmer made what many considered his last cinematic appearance, and it was exactly the kind of full-circle moment that Hollywood usually only dreams up. 36 years after he first suited up as Tom Iceman Kazansky in Top Gun, he returned for the sequel, Top Gun Maverick. But this time, the swagger was gone. The sharp jawline, the smirk. The challenge in his eyes. It had all softened. What replaced it wasn't weakness, though. It was gravity. The decision to include Iceman in the sequel wasn't just nostalgic fan service. It was a tribute, a farewell. And perhaps in Val's case, a carefully chosen curtain call. His appearance in the film is brief, but unforgettable. Iceman, now an admiral, is dealing with a serious illness, mirroring Kilmer's real-life health struggles. He can no longer speak much, instead communicating through typed words on a screen. When he finally does speak aloud to Maverick, it's just a few lines, aided by AI technology that recreated his voice using archival recordings. The voice sounds like Val, but it's not exactly Val. And somehow, that uncanny blend makes the moment hit even harder. Tom Cruise and Kilmer didn't rehearse the scene over and over. According to those on set, they barely needed to. The weight of real-life friendship, the passage of time, and everything Kilmer had endured brought a quiet intensity to the scene. You could feel it before a word was spoken. When Maverick walks into that room and sees Iceman, audiences around the world did the same thing. They leaned in. Not just because of who was on screen, but because of what it meant. This wasn't just a reunion. This was a goodbye wrapped in character, cloaked in fiction, but entirely real underneath. Director Joseph Kosinski later said, "It was incredibly important to Tom and to all of us that Val be in the film. This story wouldn't feel whole without him." For Kilmer, the return wasn't about reclaiming the spotlight. He didn't need to prove anything. He already had decades of performances that spoke louder than he ever could now. This role was about presence, about being seen, about finishing what he started. The studio used artificial intelligence to rebuild his voice for the film. Synantic, a voice synthesis company, worked with hours of previous recordings to craft something close to Kilmer's original sound. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. And more importantly, it gave him a voice again, if only for a few minutes. Fans were stunned. Some cried, others applauded. Social media lit up with messages like, "That scene broke me, and I wasn't expecting to feel this much." But what most people didn't know is that Val had been deeply involved in shaping that moment. It wasn't something done to him. It was something done with him. He helped craft the scene. He chose the words. He wanted it to feel honest, vulnerable, and it did. After Top Gun Maverick, he didn't return for any major projects. No press tours, no acting announcements, just quiet, and a sense that he had said what he needed to say on screen. But off-screen, he still had more to share. And while the movie marked the closing of one chapter, it didn't close the book. There was still something waiting, tucked away in a phone, captured in a video, shared only when the timing felt right. And that message would come, not with a Hollywood score or a studio budget, but with silence, stillness, and a whisper of goodbye. A life in fragments. In the last years of his life, Val Kilmer communicated through fragments, pieces of poetry, sketches, Instagram posts, voice-assisted videos, and cryptic captions that often left fans reading between the lines. After the world watched Top Gun Maverick, many assumed that would be the final word from Kilmer. But those who followed him online knew better. Something about the way he used social media felt deliberate, like he was still building towards something. His Instagram feed wasn't typical celebrity fare. You wouldn't find behind-the-scenes movie teasers or polished endorsements. Instead, it was a mix of watercolor paintings, old behind-the-scenes photos, abstract art, scripture verses, and the occasional cryptic selfie. Some taken long ago, others hard to date. And every so often there'd be a video. Never flashy. Always quiet. Always strange, in that unmistakably Val Kilmer way. One of the most talked about came in February 2025, just a few weeks before his death. In the short clip, Kilmer is seen sitting beside artist David Cho, placing a Batman cowl on his head. Cho tells him, "You look great," and Kilmer, barely audible, replies, "I'm ready." The video exploded online. Fans immediately thought it was a sign. Was he making a return? Was there something coming? Was this a goodbye? What no one knew at the time was that the video wasn't recent. It had been filmed years earlier. According to reports, Kilmer had saved a number of clips like that. Private videos, voice memos, even journal-style recordings filmed on his phone. Some were performances, some were rants, some were emotional confessions. He never said exactly what he planned to do with them. Maybe he didn't know himself, but he kept creating, even when the world had stopped asking. For someone who had once lived at the center of fame, Val's later years were surprisingly removed. He didn't chase headlines. He didn't do talk shows, but he paid attention. He stayed plugged in, not to Hollywood, but to life. And he used his art, his feed, and his camera to capture little pieces of what he saw. In one post, he shared an image of a cactus growing out of cracked pavement, captioned with the single word, "resilient." In another, a photo of his hand covered in paint. No explanation given. Each post felt like a breadcrumb, a piece of something bigger, not a story he was telling, just one he was quietly leaving behind for those willing to look. But behind the public-facing account, there was more. Those close to him said he often filmed private messages on his phone. Some he sent to friends, others he just stored. He'd film while sitting in bed, while sketching, while watching old movies. There was no script, no lighting, just moments. That habit of documenting the ordinary was something Kilmer had practiced for years. Even during his rise to stardom, he was always behind a camera, recording, archiving, saving, not for fame, not for control, but maybe for connection. It's what made the later footage, the unseen clips, so powerful. They weren't curated for the spotlight. They were personal. And as his health declined, it became clear to those around him that he was preparing to leave behind something final. Not a performance, not a film, something different. What remained in those final months was quiet. But it wasn't empty. Because somewhere on that phone, somewhere among all the fragments he'd captured, was a message. The final message. In the days leading up to his death, Val Kilmer grew increasingly quiet. He was surrounded by a few close friends, his children and a nurse who had become like family. Though he could barely move and could no longer speak in his own voice, he remained alert, his eyes still curious, still full of life. And then, one evening, according to those closest to him, he picked up his phone and recorded something. A final message. It wasn't shared online. It wasn't meant for the world. Not at first, but word of it eventually surfaced, passed along from those who had seen it, heard it, and been moved by it. Val Kilmer's final message before he died at 65 is heartbreaking. Using his AI-assisted voice, Val said softly, "If you're hearing this, I've already left. But don't be sad. I've lived 1,000 lives, and I loved them all, even the hard ones." He paused, then added, "The silence never scared me. What scared me was not being heard. But you heard me. That's enough." He ended with a whisper, barely audible even with voice assistance. "Thank you. I love you all. Don't forget to dream." The message was short, but haunting. No dramatic music, no background. Just the sound of a man who had spent his life transforming into other people, finally speaking as himself. According to reports, ABC World News Tonight anchor David Muir addressed the story, saying, "This is so sad, but it reminds us of the depth of a man we thought we already knew." The message, according to insiders, wasn't meant to go public. It had been saved on his phone, discovered later by family, and shared quietly among those who loved him. And perhaps that made it even more powerful because it wasn't for headlines or legacy. It was for closure, for connection. This wasn't a grand Hollywood ending. There were no cameras, no scripts, no lights, just Val, stripped of everything except his thoughts and the soft glow of a phone screen. Val Kilmer's final message before he died at 65 is heartbreaking, not because of its sadness, but because of its honesty. It captured everything he was: a performer, a poet, a man who fought for his voice, then found another way to speak. In the end, it wasn't about the roles. It wasn't about the fame. It was about being heard one last time and choosing his goodbye on his own terms. And in that quiet final moment, he said everything. What would you say if you knew it was the last time the world would ever hear your voice?